Hector Hugh Munro, or Saki, was born in British Burma in 1870 and was educated almost entirely by governesses before being sent to England at the age of 12 to further his education. He would return to India to follow in his father's footsteps as an imperial police officer, but returned to England after several bouts of fever laid him out. Munro began writing historical pieces for British magazines, but soon moved to writing political satire for newspapers. Much of his work contrasts with the conventions of Victorian and Edwardian England, with ruthless, honest struggles of nature and humanity. Many figures in authority meet their untimely deaths or downfalls to the whims of nature, his most famous being the interlopers and the toys of peace. Look for wit and wisdom, even the macabre, in Saki's characters to learn a moral lesson, as his characters haplessly forge ahead to their gloom and doom. The Cupboard of the Yesterdays by Saki. War is a cruelly destructive thing, said the wanderer, dropping his newspaper to the floor and staring reflectively into space. Oh, yes, indeed, said the merchant, responding readily to what seemed like a safe platitude. When one thinks of the loss of life and limb, the desolated homesteads and the ruined— Oh, I wasn't thinking anything of the sort, said the wanderer. I was thinking of the tendency that modern war has to destroy and banish the very elements of picturesqueness and excitement that are its chief excuse and charm. It is like a fire that flares up brilliantly for a while and then leaves everything blacker and bleaker than before. After every important war in Southeast Europe in recent times, there's been a shrinking of the area of chronically disturbed territory, a stiffening of the area of chronically disturbed territory, a stiffening of frontier lines, an intrusion of civilized monotony. And imagine what may happen at the conclusion of this war if the Turks should really be driven out of Europe. Well, it would be a gain to the cause of good government, I suppose, said the merchant. But have you counted the loss, said the other. The Balkans have long been the last surviving shred of happy hunting ground for the adventurous, a playground for passions that are fast becoming atrophied for want of exercise. In old bygone days, we had the wars in the Low Countries always at our doors, as it were. There is no need to go far afield into malaria-stricken wilds if one wanted a life of boot and saddle and license to kill and be killed. Those who wished to see a life had a decent opportunity for seeing death at the same time. Well, it is scarcely right to talk of killing and bloodshed in that way, said the merchant reprovingly. One must remember that all men are brothers. One must also remember that a large percentage of them are younger brothers. Instead of going into bankruptcy, which is the usual tendency of the younger brother nowadays, they gave their families a fair chance of going into mourning. Every bullet finds a billet, according to a rather optimistic proverb, and you must admit that nowadays it is becoming increasingly difficult to find billets for a lot of young gentlemen who would have adorned and probably thoroughly enjoyed one of the old-time happy-go-lucky wars. But that's not exactly the burden of my complaint. The Balkan lands are especially interesting to us in these rapidly moving days because they afford us the last remaining glimpse of a vanishing period of European history. Well, when I was a child, one of the earliest events of the outside world that forced itself coherently under my notice was a war in the Balkans. I remember a sunburnt soldierly man putting in little pin flags in the war map, red flags for the Turkish forces, and yellow flags for the Russians. It seemed a magical region, with its mountain passes and frozen rivers and grim battlefields, its drifting snows and its prowling wolves. There's a great stretch of water that bore the sinister but engaging name of the Black Sea. Nothing that I'd ever learned before or after in a geography lesson made the same impression on me as that strange named inland sea. I don't think its magic has ever faded out of my imagination. And there was a battle called Plevna that went on and on with varying fortunes for what seemed like a great part of a lifetime. Well, I remember the day of wrath and mourning when the little red flag had to be taken away from Plevna. Like other mature judges, I was backing the wrong horse, at any rate the losing horse. And now today we're putting little pin flags again into the maps of the Balkan region, and the passions are being turned loose once more in their playground. Well, the war will be localized, said the merchant vaguely. At least everyone hopes so. Oh, we couldn't wish for a better locality, said the wanderer. There's a charm about those countries that you find nowhere else in Europe. The charm of uncertainty and landslide, and the little dramatic happenings that make all the difference between the ordinary and the desirable. Well, life is held very cheap in those parts, said the merchant. Well, to a certain extent, yes, said the wanderer. I remember a man at Sofia who used to teach me Bulgarian in a rather inefficient manner, interspersed with a lot of quite wearisome gossip. I never knew what his personal history was, but that was only because I didn't listen. He told it to me many times. Well, after I left Bulgaria, he used to send me Sofia newspapers from time to time. I felt that he would be rather tiresome if I ever went there again. And then I heard afterwards that some men came in one day from heaven knows where, just as things do happen in the Balkans, and murdered him in the open street, and went away as quietly as they'd come. You will not understand it, but to me there is something rather piquant in the idea of such a thing happening to such a man. After his dullness and his long-winded small talk, it seemed a sort of brilliant esprit de sale on his part to meet with an end of such ruthlessly planned and executed violence. The merchant shook his head. The piquancy of the incident was not within striking distance of his comprehension. I should have been shocked at hearing such a thing about anyone I had known, he said. The present war, continued his companion without stopping to discuss two hopelessly divergent points of view, may be the beginning of the end of much that has hitherto survived the resistless creeping in of civilization. If the Balkan lands are to be finally parceled out between the competing Christian kingdoms and the haphazard rule of the Turk banished to beyond the Sea of Marmora, the old order, or disorder if you like, will have received its death blow. Something of its spirit will linger perhaps for a while in the old charmed regions where it bore sway. The Greek villagers will doubtless be restless and turbulent and unhappy where the Bulgars rule, and the Bulgars will certainly be restless and turbulent and unhappy under the Greek administration. And the rival flocks of the Echarts and the Patriarch will make themselves intensely disagreeable to one another wherever the opportunity offers. The habits of a lifetime, of several lifetimes, are not laid aside all at once. And the Albanians, of course, we shall have with us still, a troubled Moslem pool left by the receding wave of Islam in Europe. But the old atmosphere will have changed. The glamour will have gone. The dust of formality and bureaucratic neatness will slowly settle down over the time-honored landmarks. The Sanjak of Novi Bazar, the Mursteg Agreement, the Kamidji bands, the Vilayet of Adrianpol. All those familiar outlandish names and things and places that we've known so long as part and parcel of the Balkan question. Well, they'll have passed away into the cupboard of yesterdays as completely as the Hansa League and the Wars of the Guises. Well, they were the heritage that history handed down to us, spoiled and diminished, no doubt, in comparison with yet earlier days that we never knew. But still something to thrill and enliven one little corner of our continent. Something to help us conjure up in our imagination the days when the Turk was thundering at the gates of Vienna. And what shall we have to hand down to our children? Think of what their news from the Balkans will be in the course of another 10 or 15 years. Socialist Congress at Uskub, election riot at Monastir, great dock strike at Salonika, visit of the YMCA to Varna. Varna, on the coast of the enchanted sea. They will drive out some suburb to tea, and write home about it as the Bexhill of the East. Now, war is a wickedly destructive thing. Still, you must admit, began the merchant. But the wanderer was not in the mood to admit anything. He rose impatiently and walked to where the tape machine was busy with the news from Adrianpol.